Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View, and we're going to be talking about a lot of different topics over the next 2 hours. So stay tuned. We're going to cover lots of topics that you will certainly want to know more about, and we'll get into issues ranging from domestic abuse to what is happening right now in terms of our culture with George Barna, looking at everything from critical race theory and Marxism to even some of the ideas of postmodernism. In between, we're going to look at some of these different articles in the news. Some very significant things have been taking place. But before I go any further, let me welcome to the broadcast a new radio station, WMFJ, which actually is heard in Daytona Beach, Florida. And it is one that has joined us today. Might mention later in the week, I believe it's on Wednesday, another radio station will join the broadcast team, and that will be the one in Las Vegas, Nevada, KKVV, which is, again, another station. We'll probably talk a little bit more about that later, but just wanted to welcome those of you. And as you listen to Point of View, you're going to hear some things probably you'll hear nowhere else. First half hour, we're going to focus some time and attention on this issue of domestic abuse. It is something we've talked about before on this program, but in some respects, a person that is probably the best able to address the issue is someone who has been through that abuse, and that's why we bring to the microphone Karen DeArmond Gardner, who actually survived a 30-year abusive marriage. And her story isn't so much about what happened to her and Guy, although we'll certainly talk about that, but what God has been doing since then. She wrote the book because she was really looking for some books that might provide help in terms of healing, and that's why we're focusing some time and attention this morning here and this afternoon on hope for healing from domestic abuse. And it is a book that we have information about on our website. So, Karen, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, Kerby. I appreciate it.
If we can, maybe tell your story briefly, because we do want to talk about the healing, but the first chapter or so is just kind of horrific of what you went through. But for anybody that wonders if you've been through abuse, you've been through it in a way that really sometimes is really pretty scary, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It's a best kept secret because we tend not to talk about it. And when we do, some people can't believe that what we're saying is really true. Or if they know him, they can't believe that he would ever do such a thing.
But again, that's part of the myth of domestic abuse and domestic violence, because oftentimes they are individuals that may be a deacon in the church or an elder, might be a pastor, might be someone in law enforcement, in your case, whatever. And these are the people we depend upon. And so when somebody says, well, he's abusive, you're going, no, not Guy, not him. That can't possibly be the case. And so in some respects, that's one of the reasons you wrote the book, to deal with some of the harsh and inaccurate myths surrounding domestic violence.
Yeah, correct. Because most of the time when we think about domestic abuse, we use the term domestic violence or battered woman syndrome, where he assaults her. It's sometimes daily, weekly, monthly, that he assaults her with his fists and leaves marks and bruises on the outside that people can see. But 80% of reported cases of domestic abuse are not physical violence. The bruises are all unseen. there from words, from control, from manipulation, from coercion. He may never land a hand, touch her. He may never slap her or hit her or choke her or do any of that. It's all very it's all through coercion, and there's so much that entails in that, and most women don't have words to describe what's happening to them because they think because he doesn't hit me, it's not abuse, when hitting is just a small part of what domestic abuse is.
You know, one of the things we've done is actually put together a little booklet on abuse. And we do talk about, of course, as you mentioned, physical abuse, but a lot of it is social abuse in an attempt to dominate, manipulate, financial abuse, control all the money, verbal abuse, which you've just alluded to, or even spiritual abuse, controlling a person's religious interests and practices and the rest. So we want to broaden the perspective. But Karen, for just a minute, talk about this book and why you wrote it, because in some respects, you wrote it because you recognize there are books out on domestic violence, on verbal abuse, on sexual abuse, things that we've talked about so often on this program. But there was, I think, a sense of frustration, which you talk about in the beginning, that you were looking for something that would give people hope. And in some respects, you say that after you got out of the abusive relationship, you thought that was the end, but rather it was really just the beginning, wasn't it?
Yes, it was the beginning of so much hard because I attended churches that didn't talk about healing. We talked about you get saved, you're going to heaven, and in between life is going to be hard. There are things you have to put up with. Jesus will stand with you. God will never leave you, but you're going to suffer until we get to heaven, and then life will be good. But that doesn't gel with the with Scripture. That Jesus talks about abundance, that there's life, there's more. Ephesians 3:20, there is so much more. And it doesn't mean a life free and easy, but what it means is that our circumstances don't have to impact our everyday life. And when you've been through domestic abuse, when someone has controlled every aspect of your life, when they have put themselves as place of God in your life, your view of God is absolutely distorted, and you think of him as abusive as your husband.
Yes.
And so you go through a time of figuring out who God really is, and sorting through those scriptures. And so when I came out of the abuse the first month, I scoured for books to tell me what happened to me. And it was hard to find books that did tell me that there were words, there were definitions there, that people knew about this, and I had never heard about it.
So,
But they didn't. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I want to let you finish your thought.
I was but they didn't tell me what I had to do with this. I thought this was my life for the rest of my life, that I had to live with the pain. And if that was the case, then I was going to bury it and not deal with it because I couldn't handle it.
Let's take a break, but when we come back, I want to get into it in more detail. But this is a book that is published by Kriegel. You perhaps can find it in your local bookstore. It came out a couple of months ago, but we know that sometimes people looking for a book also would like a connection or a link. And, of course, we have that to this book. You can get it in paperback or Kindle. Also have a link to Karen in case you'd like to comment or ask a question or interact with her. Let me just say that there's a section on victim, then a section on survivor, a section on overcomer, then a section on conqueror. And if that's not enough, then a whole section, don't stop, there's more. And it is written in such a way, we'll talk about this after the break, in which there are some opportunities for you to encounter God. Then as you're reaching for more, actually have some questions and discussions. So this is something that you could go through individually, but I suspect many of you may want to use this to go through and help individuals, maybe in a group or a Sunday school class or a small group, to actually deal with some of these issues of finding hope and healing after domestic abuse. We'll continue our conversation right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You've probably chanted at one time or the other, we're number one. But sometimes being number one isn't something positive. If the legislation before Congress passes, the United States would be number one in taxes. The Tax Foundation calculated combined tax rates for individual incomes across major nations. If you look at their chart, you will see that currently the United States is in the middle with tax rates comparable to Switzerland, Turkey, Spain, and the UK. Under the current plan in Congress, the combined U.S. tax rate would climb significantly and leap over every other country in the developed world. Even with these high taxes, the federal government would still not be able to pay for all the spending in this legislation. One reason is the economic fact that when you raise taxes, you don't always raise more tax revenue. Individuals and companies will focus their economic activities and investments elsewhere. But a more important issue is that this legislation will cost much more than advertised. We are told that the bill will cost $2 trillion, and proponents point to a recent cost estimate from the Congressional Budget Office. But they're forced to score the bill under the budget tricks and gimmicks that really disguise its true cost. The Penn-Wharton budget model estimates the cost at $4.6 trillion over 10 years, assuming temporary provisions become permanent. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget puts their estimate at $4.9 trillion if the tax credits and programs are made permanent. Democrats in the House and Senate won't tell you some of these important facts. Most of the establishment media won't tell you this either, but I just did. I'm convinced that most Americans would be against legislation that would make us number one in taxes and yet not even come close to paying for it. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Karen DeArmond Gardner as we talk about her book, Hope for Healing from Domestic Abuse. It is published by Kriegel. Also have a link to anotheronefree.com. And as we just pointed out, leaving is just the beginning. Sometimes when you leave an abusive marriage, nothing is fixed. Matter of fact, the journey sometimes just begins. And I know that a man or a woman that has been in an abusive relationship wants to eventually not be defined by that. But Karen, before we go on, let's make at least deal with one of those other myths that you address, and that is there are people listening right now in an abusive marriage that are saying, I can't leave. And people on the outside looking in say, what do you mean you can't leave? You can just leave him. You can leave her. And yet there is a dysfunction that is in a codependency that is working there that oftentimes makes it very difficult to leave. And that's something you address in the book as well.
Yes, I don't consider it codependency. It's close. There's a couple of factors in there. It's trauma bond. You're tied to him.
Yes.
He, from the beginning of the marriage, once you say I do, some abusers immediately come out of the gate. They rip off the mask. You see the full monster standing before you. And it starts ugly right from the beginning. And others, they take their mask on and off, and some do it slowly. And so with that, over time, they condition you on how to respond to them, and your world begins to revolve around theirs, not because you want it to, but because if it doesn't, there are punishments not necessarily physical, but you'll be punished with silence, or something will be taken away from you, or any number of things. And so she forgets how to think for herself. She forgets about herself because he makes sure that he's front and center. On top of that is cognitive dissonance, where your brain has so much trouble processing what is happening to you, and you begin to make excuses for him because this is what he wants. Well, he had a bad day at work. It's really not his fault. It's these people's fault. It's somebody else's fault, but it's never his. It must be me. I must be the problem. And so it's not something that you even recognize that you take on. You don't even realize, like, as an example, I like my steak medium, but throughout the marriage, because he liked his well done, somewhere along the line, I started ordering my steak well done, and I don't even know when I started doing that. And it was months after I was out when I realized I don't like a well done steak. It's tough. Why am I doing this? And didn't know that it happened. And that's just a small way of how that conditioning happens. And then, as some say, and I had this said by someone very close to me, well, you're an adult, you could have left. And it's like, if it was that simple.
Yes. Because
there's so much fear involved. You are so afraid. Even if he's never hit you, you know what he's capable of. He will act like he's going to hit you. He will throw things. He'll punch holes in the wall, and he'll come short of physical violence, but you know what he's capable of.
Wow. Well, let's now take it to those that have actually left. And that's probably the biggest surprise. The individual that you thought was the source of your problems is still in the background, maybe not physically, but emotionally. And now you're dealing with uncertainty because of financial situations, uncertainty in terms of the fact that this was a controlling person, and now you have to make so many decisions on your own. And something I know that you've written about on your blog, and that is the issue of shame and anxiety that comes. So help individuals through that particular stage, because that's one of the most significant ones, isn't it?
It is. Shame is the biggest one. Women, whether he seeks the divorce or she does, women carry the shame of divorce. There must be something wrong with you because you couldn't keep your man. I wouldn't put up with that for 5 minutes, but we thought that also. I even said that out loud to him while we were dating. I would never allow. And so he was very covert in his process of getting to me until my non-negotiable happened. And so with that, that fear, that shame, I failed in some way. I must have failed, and it's not our failure. It's his failure. It's not mine. It's not hers. But we still carry the weight of that when we go into a church. We carry the shame of divorce, and shame. Sometimes you can see it all over somebody, and other times it's so deep that you can't see it, but you can hear it. You can see it in behaviors, and shame is insidious, and it lies to us constantly about our worth and our value, about who we are, about who God is.
Can you share what was helpful to you? Because I do have a link to your website, and I know people may want to contact you or get some other advice. Certainly, I've made it possible for people to get a copy of this book. But it seems to me that the way you've written it is so that individuals, whether they're going through it individually or they're going through it with their family, can actually, at the end of each one of these chapters, begin to identify particular issues, answer some of these particular questions. And so whether a person uses this book or other material on your website, they can go through it individually, but they can also maybe find somebody to go alongside them. It could be a pastor, a counselor, a trusted friend, because these are stages that you are going to go through, and it's important to have somebody that can give you some perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. That was my hope, is because I know there's so many women that can't afford a trauma counselor, and going to just a counselor will not always help. If they don't understand the dynamics of the domestic abuse, they can sometimes do more harm than good. And that even goes for lay leaders and pastors. If they don't understand the dynamics, that can happen. And so this is an end all, and it looks like it's like if you follow the book chapter by chapter, by the end, you'll be all healed. And actually, that's not even really true. You'll be more healed than when you started, because healing is a process that we do for our entire life. But there are places where we are more healed than at other times. It's not linear. It's more like a toddler scribble. It's up and down and all around and backwards, or you could describe it as one of those giant roller coasters that are really scary. You feel like you're chugging up, and you get to the top and you feel really good, and then all of a sudden there's a nosedive.
And again,
and that's all normal. It is normal to have those experiences.
And again, so much of what you have in this book allows people to, in a sense, give themselves some grace in the midst of some of the struggles that they have, but also gives them some real direction. But if we can, just before we run out of time, let's talk about what is available at anotheronefree.com. There's a way for individuals to contact you, leave their email, and a variety of other ways to learn from some of this, because this has become, if you will, a ministry of yours, and it's something I wanted our listeners to know about, not just the book, but the opportunity to connect up with you in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Being a trauma advocate is having the ability now to be able to walk women through that beginning after they leave. Because it's statement, leaving is just the beginning, and it's not the beginning of easy. It's the beginning of hard work, but it's also the beginning of wonderful. And so it's freedom, just not free from their abuser, but freedom as an everyday victory that we can have. And so I have resources on my website, and I have my email there so that women can reach out, because sometimes we just need someone to talk to that understands what we're experiencing, especially when we do not have the words to describe what we're feeling.
And again, this is one of the things that so excited me about this book, because even though we've talked about such issues of abuse and domestic violence and the rest, no one can speak more truthfully and compassionately to the issue than someone who's been affected by it. And so I wanted you to know about what Karen's ministry is. And again, you can find that at anotheronefree.com. Of course, we have all of that at our website, pointofview.net. The book, Hope for Healing from Domestic Abuse, came out a couple of months ago, so you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. But if not, you can go to her website or even our website and find out a little bit more. It is something that even if you are not dealing with abuse, let's face it, you know somebody that is, and you can pass some of this information on to them. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to focus on that today here at Point of View. Going to take a break. We have a lot to cover, especially a lot of issues in the news, and we'll talk about that right after this.
Wouldn't it be great if there was one day a year devoted to generosity, a day when people focused on giving of themselves to make a difference? Well, here's the good news. A day like that does exist, and it's happening tomorrow. Giving Tuesday is a global day of generosity taking place November 30th. There are plenty of ways you can make a difference tomorrow. Here's something you can do that will have a great impact, but only take a few minutes of your time. Give to Point of View. When you give to Point of View, you're equipping more Americans to stand up for faith, family, and freedom. There's a real need for that in our nation, a need that you can help fill with just a little generosity. So will you consider a gift to Point of View tomorrow in honor of Giving Tuesday? Together, we can reach more people with God's truth and equip them to stand up for it. Give by visiting pointofview.net or by calling 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let's get into some of the issues in the news. But just before we do so, might just mention that if you receive an email from me regularly, you probably just about an hour ago received an email reminding you that tomorrow is Giving Tuesday. Now, we don't make a big deal about it, but I understand we're probably going to have a match, and some people like to wait till that is the case. And I spent some time talking about the fact that, I hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving, and yet we are in the midst of what I call consumerism, which can sometimes just drown out the whole spirit of the holiday season. I actually devoted one chapter in my book on a biblical view of economics to this issue of consumerism because it's a concern that I have. But there is certainly a great antidote, I think, to consumerism, and that's generosity. We've talked about that many times before, and this is a time in which we can be generous with individuals that are around us by giving them gifts. We can be generous to our own church, and I encourage you to think about what you can do to support a church that is ministering to you. I hope that you will also consider supporting this radio station that carries this. Many of these stations are non-commercial stations, and they have a real financial need there as well. But in that list, I hope you'll also consider us, because we do depend upon your financial gifts to bring these programs to you. And I thought I might even mention that this last half hour, we spent some time talking about this idea of abuse. And I'm holding up right now one of the booklets that we have made available to our donors. If you are one of the people that joins the Truth Team at a significant level, these booklets come to you in the mail. This particular one came out a while ago, Abuse and Domestic Violence. So if you say to yourself, I'm kind of interested in the topic, I'd like to know a little bit about it, because from time to time I run into people that maybe are abused, or maybe I've had an abusive relationship, maybe even with my family in the past, and I'm trying to make some sense out of it. But you know what? I probably am not going to sit down and read a 200-page book. But if you give me what you think is the most important facts in 10 minutes, I'd be interested. Well, that's kind of the premise of all of these booklets, on whether it's critical race theory, climate change, whether it's the issue of energy, whether it's messianic prophecy, whether it's arguments for the reliability of the Bible, whatever. I try to take what we think are some of the best articles or information we decided to actually put on the air in terms of some of the research, and put it in something you can really read in about 10 minutes. And so those are booklets that we've been making available for quite some time. And if you haven't joined at the Truth Team level, I would encourage you to do so. But most importantly, as you go to the website, pointofview.net, and we'll find information about Karen Gardner, who we just interviewed, or next hour, we're going to spend some time for a little bit with George Barna on some of his research on everything from Marxism to humanism. And then we have even posted one that we'll get to next time we have him on, the subject of the millennial generation. Those are all available at the website, pointofview.net. But we also have a banner that says Giving Tuesday, and that is an opportunity for you to make a decision about what you would like to give to this ministry, and I hope you'll consider that. And for those of you that receive an email, you probably received that about an hour ago, and you can respond in that way, or you certainly can go to the website. Well, let's go to some of the articles that I've posted for you today. The first one I won't spend a lot of time on, but it's worth mentioning that Steve Malloy in his piece talks about raising energy prices through intimidation. Now, what does he mean? Well, first of all, let's look at the gas prices right now. Nationwide, the estimate is gas prices are at about $3.30 is the national average. Now, there's some below that. Texas is like 2.9, less than $3 a gallon, all the way out to California, which is almost $5 a gallon. I think it's 4.7 is what I saw there. So you can see that varies from state to state, locale to locale, but the prices have been going up because we are facing what looks like a shortage. And so the decision on the part of the president is, well, let's then encourage OPEC to pump more oil. I have a better idea. Why don't we just pump our own? But, when you start canceling pipelines, guess what happens? You then all of a sudden become once again dependent on OPEC, who right at the moment haven't been real interested in helping us out. So the Biden administration announced the other day that it was going to release millions of barrels of oil from the strategic reserves, which is why it's there usually when we had some crisis. But I think this crisis came about in part because of the policies implemented by this administration, but also by what's going on in Congress. So if you read this piece, by the time you get to the fourth paragraph, you recognize that there was a committee hearing the other day which brought various CEOs from what's called Big Oil. And the attempt was trying to create a spectacle on Capitol Hill, kind of similar to what happened in 1994. Again, for some of you that are younger listeners, you weren't even alive then, but in 1994, at that time, Congress brought in some of the tobacco industry executives and then pressed them testifying under oath about the health risks of cigarettes. Now, there had been other situations like that before, but this was an attempt to make such a spectacle that so-called big tobacco would never recover from it. And so the goal here was to try to then bring Big Oil in so that, again, they would never respond effectively and that we would blame everything having to do with climate change on them. It didn't quite go that well. And again, Steve Malloy's piece helps you understand that what was interesting is even though there was an attempt to try to draw some blood, as one individual put it, the questioners were unable to draw any blood, in part because the fact, if you've been paying attention, some of Big Oil has been talking about wanting to try to find all sorts of solutions to climate change. Now, how serious they are to it is a whole other issue, which we won't get into. But I thought it was interesting to say in this particular article that while there are a fairly significant number of people complaining about the price of gas at the pump, they almost never go back and say, well, maybe it could be due to the fact that we have certain administration policies that have been implemented and the attempt of, at least in the House of Representatives, run by the Democrats, to try to do what they can to actually extract as much as possible in terms of apologies or even getting some kind of shame or ridicule on Big Oil. And now they've begun to ask and issued subpoenas for more information. And I was unaware of this, that already these companies have submitted more than 100,000 pages in response to those initial requests from the committee. And after a while, you just say, how much more? And so this has almost been an attempt to just intimidate Big Oil. And after a while, you got to recognize that even though the industry is dependent upon any kind of search, research, refining and distributing of that oil and other petroleum products, that level of intimidation after a while might cause some of them to rethink whether they want to do what I think would be in the best interest of Americans right now, especially as we get into a time when we're not just talking about gasoline at the pump, but for some of you that have heating oil and the rest, you might be concerned about that as well. So that's my first article. I want to spend a lot of time on it, although, again, I might just mention that we do have a booklet on the whole issue of energy, climate, and the rest that you might want to read. But I want to then now get to the next article. This comes from our good friend Mike Huckabee, in which he entitled it, Beware of the Invasion of the Fact Checkers. And Mike Huckabee starts by saying this. When we talk about so-called fact checkers such as PolitiFact, we typically put quotations around the word fact. So he's got air quotes around the word fact. That's because when it comes to politics, these websites often select their facts, in air quotes, carefully, leaving out or shading information that is inconvenient and sometimes even manufacturing it as needed. Now, if you've listened to Point of View any length of time, you know that I've talked about the fact that sometimes the fact checkers need to be fact-checked. we'll find out more of that next hour. We're going to get into some other issues about COVID-19, the new variant, and the rest, but we'll leave that for an hour from now. But interestingly enough, PolitiFact was actually created back in 2008, in case you don't know that. They've now joined the Poynter Institute, and that now is a group of 60 fact-checking organizations now on 6 continents that are actually engaged in doing fact-checking, and they're also supposedly training journalists from countries around the world to actually do journalism. And if you watch the state of journalism, you might be a little concerned about what they must be teaching. But the point that he makes, and I'll let you read it in its entirety, is he takes one good example of a fact check that was done that related to the false picture, they said, that was being portrayed of Kyle Rittenhouse. And of course, now that we've had the court case, now that we've seen all the testimony, we recognize that the actual case that was presented in the media, even some of the tweets by former President Donald Trump, actually were accurate, and yet they actually labeled those as either false or misleading or lacking context. So just a good example. You always need to be discerning, and just because a fact checker said something's wrong or that something is right, might want to check it out someplace else, because sometimes the fact checkers need to be fact checked. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View.
your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, let me just mention at the top of the hour, we're going to have George Barna with us. One of the pieces, What Americans Find Attractive About Marxism, an incredible survey, which we'll get into. Might have time to also talk about postmodernism and secular humanism. We've also, as a service, even posted one on millennials, which we won't get to probably with him next hour, but we will get to in the future. But I kind of like to give you a preview. Some of you like to read ahead, and so we gave you that information as well. If you go to our website, you'll notice right now that my commentary today is we're number one in taxes, something I've talked about before, but one of the things I appreciate is when you hear it, it's one thing, when you can read it, and then we have all sorts of links, and Karen has done a great job of not only linking to the original article, but then the Tax Foundation article and the rest, in case you find yourself engaged in a conversation with somebody who said, no, that can't be true. We give you all the facts, we give you all the charts, the graphs, and others, so that you can actually look at them for yourself, print them out, show other people so they can't dispute it. Well, they can turn their blind eyes to it anytime they want, but at least we give you all the facts so that you look like you know what you're talking about, because after all you do, because you've been listening to the program, reading and investigating, and then sharing that with others. But of course, I call it number one in Texas because, you know, we've always, in many football games lately, we're number one. Well, you don't want to be number one in taxes. And the first time I brought that up, I had people calling in before we even put them on the line because they hadn't heard the whole story. No, we're not number one in taxes now. And if you look at the Tax Foundation chart, you will see that we're kind of in the middle of the pack, actually in the lower part of the middle of the pack with Switzerland, Turkey, and Spain. But now, here's the but. If indeed we pass what is now in front of the United States Senate, and we're going to give you an take action item on that very quickly here, you would then have the highest taxes in the developed world. And so you can see the numbers and see what it is. And I also take on a second issue in this commentary because we're told that the bill would cost $2 trillion. Now they're starting to even use a smaller number, but we'll take the $2 trillion number because I have also said that that can't possibly be accurate, because it's just full of tricks and gimmicks. Now, the Congressional Budget Office has to go along with those tricks and those gimmicks. I'm going to say something about that in just a minute, which is in a future commentary coming out. But if you just look at the models from the Penn-Wharton budget model, and we have a link to that, they estimate it's closer to $4.6 billion. If you go to the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, it's probably closer to $4.9 trillion. And I would have to say, most of you would agree that there's a difference between spending $2 trillion and $5 trillion. And that's why, now this is not in the commentary, but it will be in a future commentary I have coming out, that you've had now Senator John Cornyn from the state of Texas, who is actually calling for the Congressional Budget Office to actually do an estimate not using the budget gimmicks. He said the American people deserve more than smoke and mirror accounting from Washington, D.C., because as we point out, if you assume that these new benefits in the bill, this child allowances, tax credits, if you assume that they're going to continue, but in order to make the numbers look smaller, they just get started and then ending. Does anybody seriously think that there is going to be any attempt to revoke child allowances, tax credits once they're in the legislation, once they're part of the IRS code? I don't. And, of course, one of my famous quotes from former President Ronald Reagan is, the closest thing to eternal life on earth is a government program. So the cost is inaccurate, and as a result, you have to say that, first of all, the amount of the cost is very, very high. Second of all, I'll also point out the fact that even if you were to assume that those numbers are right, and I don't, I know those numbers are fallacious, you also have to understand that individuals and companies and businesses focus their economic activities, investments elsewhere if you're going to actually raise taxes. And so this idea that raising tax rates will raise tax revenue, a little bit, but not anywhere like you think it will. So that is something to consider. Tomorrow's commentary is on the inflation, and I thought I would real quickly just mention that our friends at the Wall Street Journal actually have a piece which we didn't post. Maybe I should have, but it wasn't worth it because it was very short. Stupid inflation tricks. And they remind us of the fact that, remember, David Letterman used to do stupid pet tricks. And then when he changed networks, they wouldn't let him use that because it was called intellectual property. Really? Stupid pet tricks or intellectual property. So then he came up with stupid human tricks. Well, anyway, he said that our favorite one here is what he calls stupid inflation tricks. And this one came from Senator Elizabeth Warren, who tried to blame the poultry cartel, if you will, for this. She says, Americans are paying record high prices for their Thanksgiving turkey because big poultry companies are paying billions in dividends, giving CEO races and earning huge profits. These companies are abusing market power. I'm going to have the Department of Justice investigate. Now, again, you got to understand that this almost is, it's difficult to say with a straight face. I'm working at it, but it's tough. To think about some of these turkey producers sitting around a table or maybe on a Zoom call saying, let's see if we can raise the prices of turkey. I mean, it's just amazing. And so either you have to believe that she's not serious, and how many times on this program we've said these people are not serious, or you have to say she's stupid, and that's not fair because, after all, as they point out, Mrs. Warren, as they said, has taught law at Harvard Law School, but she apparently thinks Americans are stupid. So anyway, that's the latest stupid inflation tricks. I think you probably know better, so I will simply leave it at that. And to just do a quick mention right now, you probably are starting to see more and more articles coming out from especially Christian groups, but even other conservative groups about the Salvation Army. So I just wanted to acknowledge that today because, as Rebecca Downs points out in this piece, the Salvation Army is losing a lot of their long-term support during this holiday season in light of organizations, and their organization in particular, which seems to be picking up this idea of anti-racism and critical race theory. What I thought was so interesting is one of the things that is actually quoted is a quote that comes from Greg Koukl. And Greg Koukl's been on the program with us before. And it's interesting because the other day I did a commentary on his idea of the Kafka trap. And in his letter, in his open letter to the Salvation Army, said, I'm not going to fall for the CRT Kafka trap that my protestations are actually evidence of my racism, and neither should you. There is a massive number of academics, black and white, Christian and non-Christian, atheists and theists, who have raised the alarm against the aggressive indoctrination and, frankly, bullying of critical race theory, not to mention the racial essentialism inherent in the view, the false witness it bears against virtuous people, and the general destruction it continues to wreak on race relations in this country. And he goes on to say, look, I'm not claiming there's no racism or there are no racist Christians, but what I am saying is that if you have an inaccurate diagnosis, then most likely the solution isn't going to be any more accurate. So there are a growing number of individuals, and I just thought I'd mention him, as well as this very good piece by Carly Mabry writing in Newsweek, who are raising real questions about Salvation Army. Haven't investigated enough to give you all the definitive facts, but sometimes we just want you to know that we have seen some of the articles, and this is one of many that have surfaced about some concerns raised about some of the documents that have come out from the Salvation Army. And so we wanted you to know about that, and if this is the first you've heard about it, do your own investigation. We'll come back to it probably sometime in the future. Might even get Greg Koukl on here to talk about it as well. But just before we take a break, let me mention that we have a lot of great information about the guests we've had on there. We also have a banner for Giving Tuesday, and I hope you'll get ready for thinking about what you might do to support this ministry. And we'd love to hear from you. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to be talking with our good friend George Barna. That coming up right after this.
Wouldn't it be great if there was one day a year devoted to generosity, a day when people focused on giving of themselves to make a difference? Well, here's the good news. A day like that does exist, and it's happening tomorrow. Giving Tuesday is a global day of generosity taking place November 30th. There are plenty of ways you can make a difference tomorrow. Here's something you can do that will have a great impact, but only take a few minutes of your time. Give to Point of View. When you give to Point of View, you're equipping more Americans to stand up for faith, family, and freedom. There's a real need for that in our nation, a need that you can help fill with just a little generosity. So will you consider a gift to Point of View tomorrow in honor of Giving Tuesday? Together, we can reach more people with God's truth and equip them to stand up for it. Give by visiting pointofview.net or by calling 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
So we're going to spend some time talking with our good friend George Barna. But just before we do so, if you just joined us this hour, I just thought I would welcome to the broadcast team WMFJ, which is in Daytona Beach, Florida. They'll begin airing the program today. And I might just, as we go through the week, also mention that KKVV in Las Vegas will begin airing the program on Wednesday. So if this is the first time you've heard Point of View, we are certainly privileged always to have George Barna on the program to give us some perspective on what is taking place. Many of you have been listening for some time know how we value what he provides. A professor at Arizona Christian University, president of the Cultural Research Center, and we've really been spending some time over the last couple of months looking at this American worldview inventory. Thought we'd focus some time and attention today on Marxism and secular humanism. But first of all, George Barna, welcome back.
Hey, Kerby, good to be with you again.
When we talk about Marxism, of course, we have produced booklets on everything from capitalism and socialism and Marxism and those kinds of things. But the reality is you found that very few people would be what you would consider to be consistent Marxist through and through. But as I dig into this particular research, which we've posted on our website as well, you do see that millions of Americans do, in some places, embrace Marxist types of views on race, money, and success, don't they?
Well, it's true. If you just look at how many people are driven by Marxist ideology, we're talking about maybe 1%, probably a little bit less than that. But, of course, that's true no matter what ideology you look at in America, because we're kind of a cut-and-paste society. We're taking ideas from all kinds of philosophies of life. But when you begin to look at, well, are people then taking a lot of information from Marxism? Are they buying into a lot of its philosophies and ideals? We do find that about 10% of the adult population is consistently drawing from Marxist principles. And so, when you look at an adult population the size of ours, that's more than 25 million people that on a regular basis are turning to Marxism for guidance in terms of how to live.
And again, we said that the real dominant worldview is this sort of cut and paste, mix and match called syncretism. If you want to impress your friends, you can talk about syncretistic worldviews. But let's get into some of the details because, again, individuals that listen to this program know that we've published and produced books on things like race and critical race theory. And one of the things that you have found is that if you ask individuals, is race used by white people to advance their economic and political interests at the expense of people of color, which is kind of an idea of what you might call cultural Marxism, you get a fairly significant percentage that agree with that, don't you?
Well, yeah, more than 4 out of 10, which really is pretty shocking. And I think to a large extent it goes back to this idea that you and I have discussed of the fact that Americans don't spend a whole lot of time thinking. We like to do stuff. We like to accomplish things. We like to point to what we've produced. And as a consequence, we buy into a lot of ideas without thinking very deeply about them. And so this is one of those areas where I think people in America sometimes embrace ideas without realizing, wow, this has dramatic consequences. And this is one of those areas. But Marxism is full of these little potholes that just kind of explode upon you as you get near them. And this is one of those where when you got 41% saying that race is used by white people to advance their own economic and political interests at the expense of people of color, I mean, that's going to color everything that takes place in our daily lives. So we do really have to stop and think sometimes about what we say we believe.
Let's talk about this idea of private property. I said before that the Bible is not an economic textbook, but the Bible assumes private property. The idea thou shalt not steal is part of that. The idea of allocating property to the tribes of Israel and just all sorts of other aspects. Even in the book of Acts, you can see that this socialist idea, the idea promoted by Karl Marx and even the cultural Marxists today, is that we should not have private property. And yet again, here's one of the questions from your survey. Allowing people to own property facilitates economic injustice. Okay, that would be something that you might believe would get very high percentages in places where people have really adopted a communist or Marxist idea. But again, you find, if I can believe this right, 27% of people agree with that position?
That's absolutely right. And again, to put that in a bigger context, with a nation the size of ours, that's over 65 million adults who believe that idea. And that has very dramatic implications for how we work together, the kinds of lifestyles that we might have. So, yeah, I mean, it's a big deal. People need to, again, sit down and think these things through. It's kind of like the abortion argument. You know, what we find in our research, I've been finding for the last 40 years, is that Americans, a large share of them, tend to be prone to the last best argument they heard, rather than stopping to think about what are the ethical and moral and spiritual foundations that I deeply believe in and that aren't going to change, and that will therefore inform my opinion of abortion today, tomorrow, a year from now, a decade from now. It's not going to change. Instead, what you've got is large portions of Americans who don't want to do the tough stuff of thinking about, what do I really believe, those absolute truths that aren't going to change, and how do I apply that to every situation of life? This is one of those areas where people need to be doing that.
I just mentioned we have posted the release, What Americans Find Attractive About Marxism. Of course, you can go to Arizona Christian University, the Culture Research Center. All those links are there. But I thought I'd take one more that not only fits in the Marxist category, but the one we'll talk about next, and that is secular humanism and postmodernism. Determining moral truth is up to each individual. There are no moral absolutes that apply to everyone at all time. 54%, a majority, believe that there are no absolutes. Amazing to me.
Well, it is. And of course, you can broaden that and talk about, are there any objective moral truths? Even if you don't want to talk about absolutes, let's talk about objective moral truth. And an even larger percentage, more than 6 out of 10 people, reject that notion. So Americans are struggling with this idea of truth. We know that only 4 out of 10 adults in our country today would say that the Bible contains truths that are still relevant, they're true, they're reliable, they're trustworthy for our lives. People aren't buying it. And of course, the importance of that are the implications. When you look at the moral choices that people are making, the fact that 2 out of 3 Americans, 68%, say that having sexual relations outside of marriage is morally acceptable, morally okay, or the growing proportion saying it's not even a moral issue. Yeah, you just do it. If it feels good, do it. It's not about right or wrong. It's about feelings. And that's how we're making our moral decisions these days.
Yes.
It's not based on God's truth, but based on our feelings.
Everybody does what is right in their own eyes. Of course, we see that in the Bible. We've been talking about Marxism. We're going to actually focus on another report, and that is secular humanism, postmodernism. And we've already sort of given you a lead into it. We'll talk about that with George Barna right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You've probably chanted at one time or the other, "We're number one," but sometimes being number one isn't something positive. If the legislation before Congress passes, the United States would be number one in taxes. The Tax Foundation calculated combined tax rates for individual incomes across major nations. If you look at their chart, you will see that currently the United States is in the middle with tax rates comparable to Switzerland, Turkey, Spain, and the UK. Under the current plan in Congress, the combined U.S. tax rate would climb significantly and leap over every other country in the developed world. Even with these high taxes, the federal government would still not be able to pay for all the spending in this legislation. One reason is the economic fact that when you raise taxes, you don't always raise more tax revenue. Individuals and companies will focus their economic activities and investments elsewhere. But a more important issue is that this legislation will cost much more than advertised. We are told that the bill will cost $2 trillion, and proponents point to a recent cost estimate from the Congressional Budget Office. But they're forced to score the bill under the budget tricks and gimmicks that really disguise its true cost. The Penn-Wharton budget model estimates the cost at $4.6 trillion over 10 years, assuming temporary provisions become permanent. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget puts their estimate at $4.9 trillion if the tax credits and programs are made permanent. Democrats in the House and Senate won't tell you some of these important facts. Most of the establishment media won't tell you this either, but I just did. I'm convinced that most Americans would be against legislation that would make us number one in taxes and yet not even come close to paying for it. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back in a few more minutes with George Barna, again, professor of Arizona Christian University, as well as president of the Cultural Research Center. And if you would like to find all that information, we have a link there, and I would encourage you to sign up because some of these reports, we just talked about release number 7, What Americans Find Attractive About Marxism, and I thought we'd focus a little more time and attention on release number 8 on postmodernism and secular humanism. But if you go to his website, you'll also notice that he's posted one on the emotional and mental health issues that hinder millennial relationships. We'll probably talk with him about that in the future. A lot of that comes from his a report, which is called Millennials in America. Wanted to give that to you so you could kind of read ahead. But let's, if we can, George, for a few more minutes, talk about the fact that, again, as you've done this survey, the American Worldview Inventory, most people have a syncretistic worldview, a cut-and-paste worldview. But you do find a percentage, a very small percentage, about 2%, that have a secular humanistic worldview. That's their dominant worldview. Maybe another percent that have a postmodern worldview. And so the tendency would be to think, well, then that's not very significant. But just as we talked about with Marxism, you might have people that would never refer to themselves as Marxist, but yet think about the world from a Marxist worldview sometimes on certain issues. And that's equally true with this issue of postmodernism and secular humanism, isn't it?
Well, it is. And, we talked about 10% of Americans frequently calling upon Marxist ideals as they make decisions. It's even more prolific with both postmodernism and secular humanism. Each of those has about 16% of the adult population, about 1 out of every 6 adults, who will frequently draw ideas from either secular humanism or 16% will draw from postmodernism. And so that begins to be a pretty substantial influence on how we're thinking. And again, if we're talking about numbers of people, I mean, it's tens and tens of millions of people, well over 30 million people turning to each of these ideologies to help point them in a direction for the future.
Let me again explain. Some people might say, okay, you use this phrase postmodernism. What does that mean? Well, it's the idea that your belief is really just tied into your culture and your cultural interpretation. And if you've ever been out witnessing to somebody and they look at you and say, well, that's great. I'm glad you believe the Bible. That's your truth, but it's not my truth. That's kind of an example of postmodernism in which individuals would simply say, well, everybody has their own truth. And so whatever you want to believe, that's very important. One of the things, George, that's so powerful about your article here is that you've got a chart in which you show the differences between, first of all, the survey for all Americans, then those who have a biblical worldview, those who tend to draw heavily on a secular humanistic worldview, and those who actually draw on a postmodern view. And one of the most striking is this. I've said before that when I interact with various humanists or atheists, even sometimes on this program, or certainly when we've been out in various debates, at least we start with the assumption that there are laws, kind of physical laws, logic is important, and we can come to at least some kind of common understanding of what might be true or not true. If you're dealing with a modernist, I should say, you just throw all that out. And one of the questions that you had on your survey, our understanding of reality is based on cultural interpretation. Well, you could only get about a third of the humanists to agree with that, but you get essentially 2/3 of the postmodernists to believe that. And that's kind of this idea that, well, you have your view of truth, I have a different view of truth, and somebody else has a third view of truth. It is really scary to think about a society in which more and more people that have bought into this idea of postmodernism believes that anything that you think is true really is just influenced by your culture and thus could be changed if you change the culture. That's pretty disgusting and very dangerous for what it could mean for the society in the future.
Well, and of course, it's a huge challenge to those of us with a biblical worldview because it's hard for us to wrap our minds around that kind of thinking. And so to have a conversation that goes somewhere with people who are coming from that place requires us, if we want to continue the conversation, to try to figure out, well, what does that even look like in your world? What does that mean? How do I use logic and reason with you? And so, and even for postmodernists, they're not even willing to buy into scientific inquiry. They think that there are all kinds of problems with that. Secular humanists think that that's, what it's all about. But so it's a very challenging reality. And it relates to many of the other ideas that people from both of those perspectives have, something they both have in common, which is there is no God, no supernatural being who's responsible for things, and that humans are part of an evolutionary process. But when you keep digging down further to figure out what that means to them, it means that human life has no intrinsic or innate value. Human beings are just as expendable as the ideas that they're throwing out there. And so once again, that's so radically different than the way a person with a biblical worldview would see things, where we know that we are created by God for his purposes. Life is a gift. It's something to protect and cherish, and they don't see things that way. So again, the arguments get pretty weird pretty quickly. And that's why understanding these things is so important, so that we know where they're coming from and we can maybe argue with it more intelligently.
You know, again, you mentioned God just a minute ago, because this is one place where you have the humanists and the postmodernists agree, don't know, believe, or care if God exists. As you well know, I've been doing a lot of interviews as well on a survey that we did at Pro Ministries, looking at primarily Generation Y and Generation Z. And when I talk about the rising number of what we call the unaffiliated, or some people call them the nuns, the people that are atheist, agnostic, or no preference, oftentimes I'll have a host say, well, that means that they are really hostile to Christianity. I said, no, you really don't understand. Yeah, there are some that maybe read Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris or Daniel Dennett or Christopher Hitchens when he was alive, that part of the new atheists, but most of them, they just simply don't care. It's not like they're against the Bible. That's not, they don't necessarily don't believe in God. They just don't really care. And so that illustrates the really striking similarity there. And then back to the point you made just a minute ago, one of your other questions, human beings are just biological machines corrupted by society. 2/3 accept that as well. So if you see people as machines and certainly an evolutionary product, and you don't believe in God, you don't believe in creation, you don't believe in the intrinsic worth of individuals, you can see how dangerous these views are, even though realistically only maybe 2% of the country actually has secular humanism as their dominant worldview. There are so many Americans that borrow from that idea when they make decisions about God or human beings.
And, Kerby, I'm sure you found in your interviews as well that sometimes we draw on these things when it's convenient. We may not necessarily believe it wholeheartedly, but when it supports some other argument we're making or some behavior that we've indulged in or some other situation where it's in our best personal interest to say, yeah, but it doesn't matter because, and then we pull out one of these other beliefs, it's easier to do that today because you've got more and more people who, as syncretists, are basically confused about what they believe.
Yes.
They don't believe anything very strongly, and so you're not going to get much pushback at all on anything that you choose to believe or do.
Yes. Again, for those of us that do debates or even talk to shows, you find that sometimes just trying to nail somebody down is so difficult. And so just some great ideas that you have posted. But let me just again encourage people to do what I always encourage them to do. Go to our website, pointofview.net, or you can go to American or ArizonaChristian.edu, Culture Research Center / but it's really easy. Just simply go to the website there, and there's a place where you can click to get the latest research from the Cultural Research Center. You also have your report on the millennials. We may talk about that next time we get you on here. And so we want people to have a chance to read ahead, and all of that is available at our website, pointofview.net. And I would encourage people to get some of these very important research studies, and then not only to read it, but maybe pass it on to elders, deacons, pastors in your area of influence, because they need to know about this as well. So, George Barna, as always, it's great to have you on the program.
Thank you so much, Kerby.
Next time we will do millennials. Of course, we do a millennial roundtable, so we've also posted that one on the millennial book. You could get it ahead of time and read ahead, because I know some of you would like to respond to that as well. Let's open up the phones. I've got a lot more to say, especially when we get into some of the things being said in the last couple of days by Dr. Anthony Fauci, Dr. Francis Collins, but also want to take some phone calls. And so if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll take some of those calls and we'll be back right after this.
Wouldn't it be great if there was one day a year devoted to generosity, a day when people focused on giving of themselves to make a difference? Well, here's the good news. A day like that does exist, and it's happening tomorrow. Giving Tuesday is a global day of generosity taking place November 30th. There are plenty of ways you can make a difference tomorrow. Here's something you can do that will have a great impact, but only take a few minutes of your time. Give to Point of View. When you give to Point of View, you're equipping more Americans to stand up for faith, family, and freedom. There's a real need for that in our nation, a need that you can help fill with just a little generosity. So will you consider a gift to Point of View tomorrow in honor of Giving Tuesday? Together, we can reach more people with God's truth and equip them to stand up for it. Give by visiting pointofview.net or by calling 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Let's, if we can, head out to South Carolina first, WAGP. And Dennis, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for taking my call. This is something I've brought up a few times. I think humanism is the real bugaboo behind all that's going on in schools. But where it came from, I think, is really important. John Dewey is called the father of modern progressive education. He took over from the former father of education in America, who was a Christian. And he had school books that were geared towards teaching children about how to read by using biblical themes. And John Dewey got in place, and I'm sure there was a lot of things that were not around anymore, but some of those books were around for 150 years.
Right.
That's about the time John Dewey took over around 1920. Not took over. That's really misleading to say that, but
it was very influential. Yeah. I mean, a lot of people read the McGuffey readers and things of that nature, as well as the various Puritan documents and all the rest. And John Dewey, for people that are not familiar, was, of course, one of the founders of the idea of progressive education, one of the drafters of Humanist Manifesto, which we now call Humanist Manifesto 1, because later there was a Humanist Manifesto 2. But you can say that John Dewey, Horace Mann, and a handful of others just completely changed education around. And to this day, Dennis, there are a lot of people that say, I'm not sure we can turn public education back simply because the foundations were laid by John Dewey back more than 100 years ago.
But the thing that Dewey did was he turned us from a godly point of view to an atheistic point of view. He called himself a radical empiricist. If it was spiritual, he didn't want to have anything to do with it. Right down to just tradition. He wouldn't hear about tradition. He wanted everything to be factual, empirical. And that has paved the way for all these people who want to think in terms of science. Science, science, science. My own son tells me, it's science, Dad.
Well, again, you have certainly brought up a very good point. We have in the past, of course, done some education about John Dewey and the foundations of public education. And the fact that you brought it up makes me think maybe we should do that again. We have a whole generation of younger people, not to mention just some new radio stations that are joining with us that need to hear that. And so you've obviously done your homework, and I think it's a good illustration of the influence of pragmatism and so much of the rationalism and, of course, the progressive education of John Dewey. So thank you so very much. And it, I think, relates very much to what we talked about in terms of the conversation with George Barna just a few minutes ago. If you were to go and ask how many people actually are, like, if you will, card-carrying humanists, not very many. There are people that are members of the Humanist Society. I've spoken to groups. I've done debates with humanists and atheists. And quite frankly, back to the point I made just a minute ago, at least with the atheist or the humanist, they believe that there are some truths. They believe that there is logic that can come to find those truths. When you start debating somebody that is a postmodernist or maybe somebody who's a pantheist like in the New Age movement, I mean, it's just it's really hard to even nail those individuals down. It's like, as some people have jokingly said, like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. So it's been difficult enough for Christianity to survive with this humanistic, atheistic onslaught that has taken place over the centuries. But it's almost more difficult to think about how we can even express the gospel in a culture where, well, I think it's fine that you believe that. That's your truth, but it's not my truth, which is the postmodern idea. That's one of the reasons why I certainly recommend that you find books by Doug Groteis, who has written about truth decay, or Greg Koukl, I mentioned him earlier, his book Tactics, or some others, just to begin to know how to share your faith with those individuals. So, Dennis, I appreciate that. Just before I run out of time, I would be remiss if I did not mention the fact that we have a new variant of the coronavirus, right? Omicron, right? And again, I won't spend much time on this, but there have been some people that have pointed out that the World Health Organization didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings. So instead of Zaik, which is is, I guess, how you say XI. First of all, they would have actually used the word, the Greek letter nu, but that NU is too easily confounded or confused with NEW. Well, then, Jai, which is XI, well, that's similar to the common name of course, the dictator in China. So there have been some people that have made a big deal about the fact that they skipped over a couple of Greek letters in the alphabet to come up with Omicron. But nevertheless, we are going to be now talking about another particular of individual that, if you will, variant. But I thought I would at least mention that Ted Cruz, said if the World Health Organization is scared of the Chinese Communist Party, how can it be trusted to call them out the next time they're trying to cover up a catastrophic global pandemic? So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, just simply to say that then because of this, we, of course, trotted out everybody. And, of course, one of those individuals was Anthony Fauci. Again, we don't spend a lot of time talking about Anthony Fauci other than the fact that if he's going to actually express information that is not accurate, then I think we're looking for those fact checkers that don't seem to show up when sometimes he speaks. For example, he talks about how Donald Trump did such a terrible job, which has nothing to do with this new variant. Then he talked about being a martyr, which again, comes with the territory. But the one which got me the most is, well, Florida does not want to get vaccinated when it's in the top 20 most vaccinated U.S. states. The number I looked at is 61%. Well, it's not 72% like Maine, but it's 61%, which is actually fairly good given the fact that the people that most need it have been able to receive it. So in the midst of this, though, he was criticizing everybody by saying, well, I am the science. Actually, the argument is that when people are criticizing him, they're criticizing science, which led to Senator Rand Paul to say, and of course, there's not a lot of love lost between Senator Rand Paul and Anthony Fauci, in which he said the absolute hubris of someone claiming they represent science. He says it's astounding and alarming that a public health bureaucrat would even think to claim such a thing, especially one who has worked so hard to ignore the science of natural immunity. Ted Cruz also, since I mentioned him before, talked about that we have a bureaucrat who has distorted science in a couple of cases and then says, well, I represent science, but then went on to say, look, the statement by Anthony Fauci and the letter from the National Institute of Health in October cannot both be true. And that is it possible that in this particular case, when Anthony Fauci says we were never involved in gain of function research and we never funded gain of function research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, when you have the National Institute of Health letter acknowledging that. And so Ted Cruz simply says, when we look at these kinds of things, if indeed you do engage in that kind of misrepresentation before Congress, there are consequences. So it has been interesting that even though Dr. Fauci came on the program, ostensibly to talk about what we can do and what we know about this new variant, most of the time was spent either criticizing individuals like Rand Paul or Ted Cruz, who, of course, as you might imagine, were going to respond on Twitter, but also simply could not give us any real new information about this. So it will be, I think, a few weeks before we know any more about the variant. The comments being made by some individuals that apparently know a little bit more about it because they're in those countries where it has happened, believe that it might make the coronavirus a little more transmissible, but maybe not as dangerous. So we'll see where that goes, but that is one of the ways in which some of that material actually surfaced over the weekend. But when we come back, I wanted to, if nothing else, illustrate the fact that sometimes the best answer that could come from some of these health officials would simply be, we really don't know. And a good example of that comes from the interview that was done over the weekend with Dr. Francis Collins, who is, of course, the head of NIH, which he was asked some questions. And so I wanted to show you a couple of graphs For those of you that have access to a computer or even your smartphone, I'm going to hold some of those up so you can see them. But I think it will illustrate to you, at least for hopefully any fair-minded individual, that there are more questions the more data that we collect than answers. And sometimes these statements that are sometimes seen as so dogmatic might not be as appropriate. I know when you're an expert, you're supposed to come up with an answer, but sometimes the best answer is we simply don't know. And I want to give you a couple of examples why we still have a lot to learn about this coronavirus. Let's take a break. Come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back in a few more minutes, let's see if we can talk about the virus for just a minute and the vaccinations and all the rest of those issues. And again, a lot of this in the news again because we have a new variant out of South Africa. And unless you are thinking, well, that's not a big deal, did you look at the stock market the other day? I mean, it is amazing to me how quickly, in some cases, stocks and all sorts of futures and everything are affected just by the threat that this could be dangerous or we could have more lockdowns. And so, of course, there was a need to trot out the various experts. I've already mentioned Anthony Fauci, so I'm going to set him aside and talk about another individual we hardly mention here, and that's Dr. Francis Collins. Now, first of all, he's a Christian who is very well known for giving his testimony. He's been criticized oftentimes by the left because he's a Christian. Lately, he's been kind of criticized by evangelicals because of some of the things he's done and said. But nevertheless, let's, if we can, illustrate again again, that sometimes the best answer is we really don't have a good answer for that. And it's something that we need to look into. And for those of you watching online, first of all, Dr. Francis Collins appeared on the program with Trace Gallagher, and he was pointing out, and I'll put this on the screen so you can see it in just a minute, that if you look at some of the states where you're getting an increased number of cases. Now, at the moment, I'm talking about cases. In a minute, we're going to talk about deaths, but we're just talking about cases at the moment. Michigan, 54% vaccinated, 59% increase in new cases. Maine, where we broadcast as well, 72% vaccinated, one of the best in the country, but again, a 31% increase in cases. New York, 68% vaccinated and an increase in 22% increase. Now let's go to Florida, where we also broadcast 61% vaccinated, minus 5%, a decline. If you look at the graph here, you can see, for those of you looking at the chart, that you can see that you have Michigan, Maine, New York, that was, and I just pulled that right off of the screen grab. And then you have this one that doesn't fit so well, and that is Florida. And I thought it was kind of interesting because the top half of the graph is blue, the bottom is red, and so there's a difference between blue states and red states. And so the question is, Dr. Collins, can you explain that when you look at Florida, which has been the whipping boy for months from especially the more liberal press, that would be ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, saying that this is endangering people. Can you explain now Florida, when compared to other states that had mandates and had governors that actually implemented all sorts of very restrictive factors, that Florida actually is decreasing the number of cases? And so you would think, well, the obvious answer would be, well, maybe this is illustrating that sometimes these mandates, some of these requirements don't make a difference. Maybe there's some other factors involved with this. But instead, as Scott Moorfield says, you have this word salad that comes from Dr. Francis Collins and then spends all his time talking about it. It just illustrates why we need to get vaccinated. And you're going, well, that's not even the question, but it's the kind of answers we're getting these days. A good example of that, now if we want to move, for example, from the issue of cases to deaths, you have, for example, this article that came out recently in which you've had a spike in the number of deaths in Israel. And when you look at the vaccination rate in Israel, I think it is the highest in the world, and yet you still see a spike in deaths in that regard. And so, again, you would say, well, maybe there are some other factors going on there. Or one other one that has been actually promoted. Matter of fact, we're going to have Alex Berenson on here, but I'll precede the fact that he points out that if you look at this particular graph, this looks at the death rate per 100,000, and it shows that the death rate for those individuals who are vaccinated is twice as high for those that are unvaccinated. Now, the fact checkers have pointed out, well, that's not UK, it's really just England. Okay, that's a clarification on that. But, again, there may be some answers for that. It could be, as I've suggested, maybe because you have so many people that have been vaccinated, you have a higher percentage of individuals that could die than others. But here's a good example when you start seeing these graphs about everybody brings their own political bias into this. If you're anti-vax, you'll say, well, that just illustrates that the vaccine is dangerous and is not protecting people. If you're pro-vaccination, you can say, well, there may be some other factors going on in light of the fact that maybe we had more people vaccinated. And so as a result, there's a high percentage of those who could die. And everybody comes off, if you will, with confirmation bias. They look for what they want to find, and so as a result, we end up with those kinds of answers. But I will once again say what I've tried to say more than once, and that is anytime somebody says something dogmatic, all you need to do is go back and look at some of the numbers and recognize there's no trend that you would expect. Let's again come back to the United States. death rate in the United States. I've shown this chart before. Matter of fact, we posted it even more recently. And if you're looking on the top, or if you're not able to see it, it is actually looking at those particular states which have the highest death rate per 100,000. Now, if you were to believe MSNBC and CNN and ABC and NBC and CBS, you would think that these would all be red states on the top and blue states on the bottom. For those of you that can see the chart, and if you want to go and find that chart, it's on our website, you will see, first of all, there's one error here, and what they do is they actually put a red state if they have a Republican governor. So in some respects, I think I wouldn't have put Massachusetts as red, I'd say as blue. If that's the case, you can see that 5 out of the top 6 with have the highest death rates are all what we would call blue states. Or if you want to look at the top 14, 9 out of the 14 are blue states. But what you're going to see is you're going to see some blue states on the top. You're going to see blue states on the bottom. You can see red states on the top, red states on the bottom. You can see red states in the middle, blue states in the middle. You're going to basically say, if you really were honest and just get away from your bias, whether you're pro-vaccination or not, whether you're pro-mandate or not, you're going to see there's just no discernible pattern. As one article said, there's no rhyme to reason. Now, there are some things that make some sense to me. If you look down at some of those where you've had a lower death rate, what do you find? It has nothing to do with red states and blue states. It has to do with the fact that people aren't densely populated. That's like Vermont, Maine, Alaska, Wyoming. What do those have in common? Not as many people face to face with each other. And so again, anytime you hear somebody trying to make the case for their particular political ideology, as soon as they start trying to use some of the facts, if you will, from the death rates or the case rate, you're going to see as many exceptions as you see rules. There may be some underlying explanations, but it's a good example of what we talk about so often in this program, confirmation bias. I bring my bias to the facts, and I don't consider anything else. And I think that was illustrated by Anthony Fauci when he was asked about the whole idea of natural immunity. He said, well, we really haven't studied that. Seriously? This has been studied in Israel for most of the year, and you've never studied that? It illustrates, again, some of the bias that people bring to the conversation. So what's the lesson? Once again, use some discernment. Read widely. Don't necessarily believe everything I have to say or anything else. Check it out for yourself. As you do, I think you'll find out that we probably need a heavy dose of humility with all of the kinds of statements that were even this weekend said in some of the talking head shows. But we're simply out of time, and we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the virus. But since it was in the news, I thought I'd give you a couple facts and figures to make you think about it. And if nothing else, warn you to be skeptical and to ask good questions. That's all we have for today. We have a lot to cover this week. It's going to be a great week of broadcasting. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Wouldn't it be great if there was one day a year devoted to generosity, a day when people focused on giving of themselves to make a difference? Well, here's the good news. A day like that does exist, and it's happening tomorrow. Giving Tuesday is a global day of generosity taking place November 30th. There are plenty of ways you can make a difference tomorrow. Here's something you can do that will have a great impact, but only take a few minutes of your time. Give to Point of View. When you give to Point of View, you're equipping more Americans to stand up for faith, family, and freedom. There's a real need for that in our nation, a need that you can help fill with just a little generosity. So will you consider a gift to Point of View tomorrow in honor of Giving Tuesday? Together, we can reach more people with God's truth and equip them to stand up for it. Give by visiting pointofview.net or by calling 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.